she came to the wrong ranch, until the little girl whispered, "God sent you." Before the story unfolds, tap that subscribe button and stay with us. The wind howled across the barren frontier, carrying with it a haze of dust that turned the horizon into a shifting blur. It was the kind of evening when the sky seemed heavy, its colors painted in muted grays and rust, as though the land itself was bracing for something unsettled. A lone stagecoach rattled over the rough trail, its wheels creaking in protest, horses lathered with sweat from the long haul. Each thundering hoofbeat echoed against the emptiness of the prairie, a lonely drumbeat against the silence of the west. When the driver finally reined in the team, the coach groaned to a stop in front of a sprawling, weather-worn ranch house. Its roof sagged in places, its paint long stripped by storms, and its wide porch stood in quiet defiance against the endless frontier. This was no town, no gathering place. It was isolation itself. The young woman inside the coach pressed her gloved hands against the seat, steadying her breath before stepping out. She carried a small, worn suitcase, the kind that held little more than a few dresses, a comb, and the fragile dreams of a new beginning. In her other hand, clutched tightly against her chest, were folded papers, the marriage documents that bound her to a future she had never seen but had been promised. The air was sharp and dry as her boots touched the dirt. She stood still for a moment, her veil lifting slightly in the breeze, and looked around with eyes that carried both fear and hope. She had traveled miles across an unforgiving land, believing that at the end of her journey she would find stability, safety, and perhaps even love. Somewhere behind that heavy wooden door, she imagined, was the man who had sent for her. She whispered to herself that this was destiny, though her heart pounded with uncertainty. The door creaked open with a suddenness that startled her, and there he stood. A man, not in a suit, nor waiting with open arms, but a tall, rugged rancher whose presence seemed carved from the very land he worked. His face bore the hard lines of a life under the sun, his jaw shadowed by days-old stubble. His eyes were narrowed, hard, suspicious, and in his hand rested the cold steel of a shotgun, leveled just enough to remind any stranger that this was not a place where trust came easy. For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the restless stomping of the horses still hitched to the coach. The young bride swallowed hard, lifting her papers as though they were a shield. "I was sent here," she said, her voice quivering but firm. "I was told. This is where my husband-to-be lives. I was told this was my place." The rancher's expression darkened, confusion and anger flashing behind his eyes. He stepped out onto the porch, boots heavy against the boards, never lowering the gun. "Your husband?" he repeated, his voice low, edged with disbelief. "Miss, you've got the wrong place. There ain't no man here sendin' for no bride." Her chest tightened, her grip on the papers trembling. She glanced at the ranch again, at the wide windows with their tattered curtains, at the endless fields stretching behind it, and then back at him. Every part of her wanted to protest, to insist there had been no mistake. But the longer she stood, in his shadow the clearer it became. She had stepped into the wrong story, the wrong life. Yet the wind seemed to press around them, as if fate itself refused to let her turn back. The driver of the coach shifted uneasily, ready to be gone, and the woman found herself frozen between retreat and surrender. The man's gaze never softened, but something unspoken lingered there, something more than suspicion. Tension stretched, the air taut, as though the land itself held its breath. And so it began, with a bride on the wrong porch, a rancher with a gun in his hand, and a truth neither of them yet understood. This was no accident, but the start of something neither had asked for. The wind howled through the gaps of the ranch house walls, rattling the loose shutters as if echoing Calder's voice when he stood firmly at the threshold, blocking her entry. His broad frame, shadowed by the dim glow of the lantern, cast a wall she could not pass. "You've made a mistake," he told her, his tone carrying both weariness and suspicion. "Whatever business you think you've got here, it ends tonight. By morning, you'll be on your way." His words fell like stones, hard and final, as though he were a man long practiced in shutting doors before they could open. The young bride, still clutching her small suitcase as though it held her last anchor to dignity, searched his face for a trace of mercy. Her breath shook as she drew a folded letter from her coat pocket, the paper already creased and worn from being read too many times on the road. "I was told. This was to be my home," she whispered, offering it to him with trembling hands. The matchmaker's script detailed her arrangement, sealed with promises she had believed to be her salvation. Calder glanced at it, his eyes narrowing, then tossed it back toward her. "That's not my name," he muttered, "not my hand, and not my problem." Still, the storm outside made it impossible to send her away. With a reluctant sigh, he stepped back, leaving her space to enter. She crossed the threshold slowly, as though intruding on a sacred place. Inside, the house felt both alive and lifeless at once, too large for a single man, yet too heavy with silence to be welcoming. Her gaze swept across the room, and what she saw struck her like a sudden chill. A photograph of a woman resting on the mantel, framed in simple wood, her features soft and kind, but eyes forever gone. Beside it, a child's toy horse sat abandoned, untouched yet placed carefully, as though waiting for small hands that would never return. The bride swallowed hard, the weight of grief pressing against her chest as though it were her own. She set her suitcase quietly near the hearth, but Calder's eyes followed her every move. He lowered himself into a chair by the fire, the leather creaking beneath him, his rifle leaning close at hand as if her very presence demanded he keep it. Nearby, for a long while, the only sound between them was the popping of resin in the firewood and the low whistle of wind slipping through the eaves. She sat on the edge of a chair, unsure if she was guest or trespasser, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, her voice nearly drowned by the crackle of the flames. "If you'll just let me stay until the storm passes." Her words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Calder did not answer. Instead, he stared into the fire, his jaw clenched, his silence carrying more weight than refusal ever could. As the hours dragged on, the room seemed to breathe around her, whispering stories she was not yet meant to know. The photograph, the toys, the untouched corners spoke louder than the man who sat across from her. She felt unwanted, yes, but more than that, she felt drawn into a sorrow that lingered like smoke in the rafters. The house carried a burden, and though she could not name it, she knew with unsettling certainty that she had stepped into a life still aching for what it had lost. By the time the fire burned low, her eyes had grown heavy, but Calder remained, rigid, a sentinel watching over a stranger he had never asked for. In that quiet, unwelcome night, the house seemed to settle uneasily around them both, as though recognizing the collision of two fates not yet ready to entwine. And though she told herself it was a mistake, that she had been sent to the wrong place, somewhere deep within, she could not shake the strange pull of belonging that clung to the sorrowed walls of his home. The night had grown still, the kind of quiet that presses against the walls and lingers long after the wind has died down. The bride sat near the fire, her fingers brushing over the worn fabric of her dress when she heard it. A faint creak, softer than the crackle of the flames, yet distinct enough to pull her head toward the staircase. She froze, listening. Again, the sound came. Light footsteps, hesitant, like the cautious tread of someone who wasn't sure they were welcome. Her breath caught as a small figure emerged from the shadowed landing. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, clutched the wooden rail with both hands as though it were the only thing holding her upright. Her pale face glowed faintly in the flickering firelight, framed by strands of unkempt hair. Wide eyes, too, old for her tender years, fixed on the stranger now sitting in her home. She made no sound, only stood there, staring with a stillness that felt heavier than words. The bride rose slowly, her skirts brushing the floor as she crossed the room with care. She lowered herself to her knees at the base of the staircase, softening her voice as though speaking to a frightened bird. "Hello there," she whispered gently, offering a small smile. "I didn't know anyone else was here." She extended a hand, open and patient, waiting for the child to take it if she wished, but the little girl said nothing. She did not move, only tightened her grip on the rail until her knuckles turned white, her lips pressed together, trembling slightly as though words were trapped inside but refused to come out. The silence stretched, delicate and brittle, filling the space between them until it became almost unbearable. Behind her, Calder's voice broke through, low and rough with something heavier than irritation. "She won't answer you." The bride turned to look at him, his face shadowed by the firelight. His eyes fixed on the floor as though speaking the truth aloud cost him something. "She hasn't spoken a word since her mother died."
The weight of his confession settled in the room like an invisible shroud. The bride turned back to the child, her heart tightening. So that was the sorrow she had felt in the walls? The silence wasn't just Calder's. It belonged to this small girl too, a silence that carried grief too deep for words. The bride lowered her hand, not in defeat but in understanding. She did not press the child further, did not force the moment to be something it wasn't. Instead, she simply nodded as though to say, "I see you. Even if you cannot speak, I see you." For a flicker of an instant, the girl's gaze softened, and her grip on the railing loosened, though she did not descend the stairs. The fire crackled, casting fleeting shadows across the walls. Calder leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a weariness that had nothing to do with the hour. The bride sensed the depth of his burden, not only his grief but the responsibility of raising a child trapped in silence. And as she looked at the girl, standing small and alone in the half-light, something inside her shifted. She realized then that her arrival on this ranch was no accident. The letter, the storm, even Calder's coldness, perhaps all of it had led her here to this moment, kneeling before a child who carried more sorrow than her young years should bear. The silence was painful, yes, but it was also a plea. A cry hidden behind wordless lips. As the girl turned and slipped back into the shadows of the hallway, her small footsteps fading into nothing, the bride felt a pull stronger than fear or rejection. She understood, without needing to be told, that her presence here was meant for something more than herself. She had been brought into this house not just to share its roof, but to share in its healing. And though Calder's silence remained cold, the child's unspoken need had kindled a warmth in her that no fire could give. The night had stretched long, and with every passing hour the bride felt more certain that she did not belong within these walls. Calder's silence had been a wall she could not scale, and though she had tried to reach the child, the unbroken quiet between them had left her heart heavy. By morning her decision was made. She would leave. She rose with the gray light of dawn, gathering what little she had brought with her. The hem of her dress brushed against the wooden floor as she folded it carefully, avoiding the eyes of the man seated in the corner. Calder had said nothing to stop her, and his silence seemed to confirm what she already knew: this was not her home. Her hands trembled as she tied the last bundle. She took a step toward the door, the weight of rejection pressing down harder than her belongings. Just as she reached for the latch, a sudden tug stopped her. She looked down in surprise. The little girl, barefoot and pale, clung to her skirt with both hands. Her wide eyes shimmered with something raw, a desperation that pierced through the silence of the room. The bride's breath caught. "Sweetheart," she murmured, kneeling, "you must let go." But the child only tightened her grip, shaking her head. Her lips parted, quivering as if caught between fear and longing. And then, in a voice so fragile it seemed to tremble with every syllable, she whispered, "God finally sent you to us." The words fell into the room like a thunderclap. Calder, seated with his morning coffee, dropped the glass from his hand. It shattered against the floor, scattering fragments that mirrored the shock on his face. His daughter's voice, silent for years, locked away since the loss of her mother, now spilled forth in a sentence that rang with faith, with hope. The bride's body froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at the child, unable to move, unable even to breathe. Those words, so unexpected, so powerful, seemed to draw the air from the room. She felt tears sting her eyes as the girl clung tighter, as though letting go meant losing her again. Calder rose to his feet, his expression stricken. His voice was hoarse, almost a growl. "Say that again," he demanded, though his tone was not unkind, only desperate. The child lifted her head slightly, her small fingers still twisted in the bride's skirt. Her lips trembled once more, but no words came. She had spoken once, as though destiny had allowed a single crack in her silence, and now the stillness returned. But that one moment was enough to shatter the walls built of grief and doubt. The bride looked from the girl to her father. Calder's hands were shaking, his eyes wide with disbelief. His silence now was not cold, but stunned, as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted. For years he had carried his daughter's quiet like a wound that would not heal, and here, before his very eyes, she had broken it with a whisper of divine certainty. A weight of purpose settled over the bride. She could no longer walk away, not after this. The girl's words were more than a plea, they were a declaration. Something greater than all of them had bound her to this place, and to turn her back would be to betray that calling. Calder rubbed a hand over his face, his voice rough and low. "One more night," he said at last, as though wrestling with something larger than his will. He would not ask her to stay, but he would not let her go, not yet. The bride nodded slowly, though her heart already knew she could not leave. She bent down and gathered the child into her arms, holding her close as the little one buried her face against her chest. A fragile warmth spread between them, the kind that comes not from fire but from a bond forged in a single, miraculous moment. As the shards of broken glass glinted on the floor, Calder turned away, his shoulders tense. For the first time since she had arrived, he looked not like a man hardened by grief, but like one humbled by fate. The silence that had once been unbearable was now filled with something new, the whisper of destiny urging them all to stay. The morning stretched long and slow, the kind of morning that carried with it a heavy stillness. The bride wandered through the ranch house, her steps quiet, almost reverent, as though she had stepped into a sacred space. Everywhere she turned, she found traces of the woman who had once lived here. A shawl folded neatly on the back of a chair. A faded portrait on the mantel, the woman's eyes bright, her smile soft. A hand-sewn quilt draped across the bed, its colors muted with age. It was as though the house still breathed with her memory, each object holding the weight of a life that had been abruptly stolen away. The bride ran her fingers gently across the edge of a dresser, pausing at a small silver comb resting there. She could almost imagine the woman sitting before the mirror, brushing her dark hair, unaware that her time was slipping away. A pang of sorrow moved through her chest, not just for the woman she had never met, but for the man and child left behind to carry the emptiness. Behind her, Calder stood in the doorway, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. His voice was low, gruff, but laced with something deeper. "She died bringing my daughter into this world." He leaned against the frame, his gaze fixed on the floor as if the words themselves were too heavy to face. "The birth took her, nearly took the little one too. I held them both, not knowing which life would remain, and when it was over, I had one and lost the other." The bride turned slowly to him, her eyes soft, her hands still resting against the wooden dresser. She did not speak, only listened, and that silence. "After that," he continued, his jaw tightening, "I swore I'd never open the door to another soul. People came around, neighbors trying to help, but pity doesn't put a man's heart back together. So I pushed them away. Pushed everyone away." His eyes, clouded with memories, flickered to her briefly before turning aside. "I learned to live with bitterness. Easier than hope. Safer than love." The bride felt the ache in his voice, the sharp edges of grief that had never dulled. His pain was not the quiet kind, it had shaped him, hardened him into stone. She knew this not from his words alone, but from the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of years spent in silence, from the hollowness in his gaze when he thought no one was looking. She said nothing, for there was nothing to fix what had been broken. Instead, she offered the one thing he had long been denied, presence. She stood with him in that room heavy with memory, letting him know he was not alone, not anymore. It was then that she felt a small tug at her skirt. The little girl had followed her into the room, her eyes wide and uncertain. Without hesitation, she pressed herself against the bride's side, clutching tightly as if afraid she might vanish. The bride's hand instinctively lowered, brushing softly through the girl's tangled hair, offering comfort without a word. Calder's gaze shifted to them and something flickered across his face, something he quickly tried to mask. For years he had shielded his daughter, protecting her fiercely, yet here she was clinging to another woman, a stranger who had walked into their lives. And instead of pulling her away, he found himself unable to break the moment. The bride met his eyes briefly. She did not speak, but the unspoken hung heavy between them. Fate had drawn her here, and something larger than either of them had tied her to this child. Calder looked away again, his hands curling into fists at his sides, battling the part of himself that wanted to resist and the part that was slowly yielding. The little girl's grip only tightened, as though afraid that if she let go, everything she had just begun to believe in would slip away. And for the first time in years, Calder allowed the silence between them not to be one of bitterness, but of fragile, unsteady hope. The days stretched into a rhythm neither of them had expected. The bride, who had come to the ranch by mistake, or perhaps by some unseen hand of fate, did not leave. Instead, she slipped quietly into the fabric of their lives. She rose early, her hands already busy before the sun touched the horizon, helping with the chores that never seemed to end on a working ranch. She mended clothes that had been patched too many times before, stirred pots of stew that filled the house with warmth, and brought a softness to the kitchen that had long stood silent. At first, Calder kept his distance. He told himself she was only passing through, a stranger whose presence was temporary. But when he caught sight of her bent over the stove, humming softly as she worked, or when he noticed the care with which she brushed the tangles from his daughter's hair, something in him stirred. It was not trust, not yet, but a quiet awareness that this woman had settled into their days in a way he could not easily ignore. Beyond the ranch, the whispers had already begun. Neighbors who passed along the road slowed their wagons and cast curious glances toward the house. In town, the talk spread quickly, a mail-order bride sent to the wrong ranch. Some laughed at the absurdity, others pitied the man who had lived so long without company, and more than a few wondered whether the stranger might be exactly what he needed. The gossip wove through the community like wildfire, yet Calder paid it no mind. He had long since hardened himself against the opinions of others. What mattered was here, within the walls of his home. Still, he struggled against the change she brought. He tried to remain aloof, answering her kindness with curt nods or silence. Yet there were cracks in his resolve, moments he could not push away. One afternoon, he found himself beside her in the barn, both of them tending to the horses. She laughed when one of the foals nudged against her, nearly knocking her into the straw. It was not a loud laugh, but light and unguarded, and for a fleeting moment he felt it wash over him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He caught himself watching her, the curve of her smile, the easy way she carried herself, and quickly turned away, unsettled by the warmth that lingered. Evenings brought more of the same. He would sit at the table with his daughter, watching as the bride moved about the kitchen, her hands busy, her voice gentle. Sometimes she told small stories from her past, never too much, but enough to fill the air with something other than silence. Calder rarely joined in, but he listened, and sometimes, when she caught his eye, he almost smiled. The child, though, made no effort to hide her feelings. She clung to the bride as though she had always belonged here, her small hand often tucked into the woman's, her laughter returning after so long without it. She smiled more freely now, her eyes brighter, her steps lighter. Calder noticed it most in the quiet moments, when his daughter leaned against the bride's side as they read together by lamplight, or when she followed her about the house, mimicking her every move. Calder knew what it meant. His daughter was opening her heart again, and that thought filled him with both hope and dread. Hope because he had not seen his child this happy in years. Dread because he feared what would happen if the woman left, as surely she must. Yet each passing day made it harder for him to deny the truth. She had come to his home by accident, but she was no longer a stranger. She had become something far more dangerous, a part of them. And as the days blended into nights and the nights into mornings, Calder began to realize that perhaps she was not just the stranger who stayed, but the stranger who might change everything. The prairie sky darkened in the way only a frontier storm could, heavy with the kind of menace that seemed to roll in from the very ends of the earth. Clouds gathered like black battalions, thunder rattled the windows, and the wind howled across the open land, bending the trees until they nearly touched the ground. Calder stood on the porch, jaw set tight as the first streak of lightning split the sky in two. Behind him, the bride gathered the child close, her voice low but calm, as though gentleness alone could hold back the storm. When the rain came, it fell in sheets so heavy it blurred the horizon. Almost at once, the barn was in danger of flooding, the animals stamping and crying out in fear. Calder pulled on his coat, ready to face the storm alone, but the bride followed without hesitation. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly, her hair already plastered to her cheeks by the wind. He opened his mouth to protest, but there was no time. Another thunderclap boomed, and together they ran toward the barn. Inside was chaos. The horses reared and kicked, the smaller animals huddled in the corners, their eyes wide with panic. Calder shouted above the roar of the storm, working to secure the doors and keep the animals from breaking free. To his surprise, the bride moved with quick, steady hands, calming the frightened beasts with her touch, speaking softly as though her voice could soothe away the thunder itself. He had not expected her to have such courage, yet here she was shoulder to shoulder with him in the heart of the tempest. Then came the accident. A gust of wind tore through the cracks in the barn, knocking over a lantern left too close to the straw. Flames leapt up in an instant, orange against the dark, and smoke billowed toward the rafters. Calder swore under his breath, grabbing for a bucket of water, but the fire spread faster than he could douse it. The animals screamed in fear, hooves pounding against the floor, and the storm outside only fed the madness within. It was then that the child's cry pierced through the din. Her favorite pony, a small chestnut mare, was trapped near the flames. The bride did not hesitate. Before Calder could stop her, she darted toward the fire, pulling her skirts tight to her body as she pushed past the smoke and heat. She wrapped her arms around the pony's halter, coaxing and tugging with all her strength. The fire licked dangerously close, singeing the hem of her dress, but she would not let go. Calder's heart stopped as he saw her stumble, the smoke choking her, yet she pulled the pony free at last. Together they stumbled back into the rain-soaked night, the terrified animal in tow. Calder was there in an instant, his arm catching her before she collapsed. For a moment he could only stare at her, breathless, shaken, his mind filled with the image of what could have been, what almost was. He had nearly lost her, and with her, his daughter's joy, his home, perhaps even the fragile piece of his heart he had long thought dead. The storm raged on through the night, but by dawn the fire was out, the animals safe, and the barn still standing, though scarred. Calder stood in the pale light of morning, watching the bride as she soothed the little pony, his daughter pressed against her side. He felt something shift deep within him, something he could not deny any longer. She was no mistake. Not a burden, not an accident sent by the cruel hand of fate. She was a miracle, one he had nearly lost and one he could not afford to let slip away again. The storm had passed, but its echo still lingered in the soaked earth and in the quiet heaviness that followed. By evening, the ranch was cloaked in a hush that seemed almost sacred. Inside the house, the hearth crackled gently, its warmth spilling across the room where the three of them sat together. Calder leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames as though they might burn away the thoughts he had carried for years. The bride sat nearby, mending the child's dress with steady hands, though every so often she lifted her gaze toward him, waiting for words he had not yet spoken. The child, drowsy from the day's chaos, nestled on the rug with her doll, half listening, half dreaming. At last, Calder broke the silence. His voice was low, roughened by the weight of truths long buried. "I ain't been much of a man these past years," he admitted. "Since my wife passed. I've lived like a ghost. Workin', eatin', sleepin', but never livin'. And when they sent you here, when I saw you standin' on my porch, I thought it was just another cruel twist of fate. Like life was mockin' me, givin' me something I never asked for." He shook his head, his hands tightening on his knees. "Truth is, I was scared. Scared to feel again. Scared to lose again. I thought keepin' my heart locked up was the only way to survive." The bride set down her needle, her fingers trembling slightly. She had heard the hardness in his words before, but now there was no anger behind them, only raw confession. For a moment she stared into the fire too, as if searching for the courage to match his honesty. Then she spoke, her voice steady but laced with sorrow. "You weren't the only one runnin' from something," she said softly. "I came here because I thought maybe, just maybe, I could start over. Back home I was nothing but a burden. My father drank himself into debt and my brothers, they didn't care much for protecting me. I worked, I begged, I did whatever I had to do, but there was no future there. When I read about mail-order brides, it sounded like a chance, maybe not for love, but for a roof over my head, for a place where I could belong." She paused, her throat tightening. "I didn't expect kindness. Didn't expect laughter. And I surely didn't expect to care." Her words hung in the air like fragile glass, and Calder felt them break something open inside him. For the first time in years he felt seen, not as a widower, not as a man drowning in silence, but as himself. Their eyes met across the firelight, and in that moment the distance between them seemed to vanish. Vulnerability had stripped them bare, leaving nothing but truth. It was then the child stirred, rubbing her eyes as she sat up. She looked from her father to the woman, her small voice cutting through the stillness with simple, innocent certainty. "She's my mama now," she whispered. The room fell silent. Calder's breath caught, his chest tightening as the words struck deeper than any confession ever could. The bride pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining with tears she could not stop. The child crawled into her lap, curling against her as if she had always belonged there. Calder looked at them, truly looked, and something inside him shifted, permanent and undeniable. The woman who had arrived as a stranger, the woman he had tried to keep at arm's length, was no longer an intruder in his home. She was part of it, woven into its walls, its laughter, its quiet nights. And in the glow of the firelight, with his daughter nestled against the woman who had risked everything for her, Calder knew the truth. She was not a mistake. She was his second chance. The night had been calm, almost too calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath after the confessions by the hearth. But the following morning shattered that fragile peace. The sound of hooves thundered across the ranch yard, breaking through the stillness. Calder stepped out onto the porch, hand instinctively brushing against the revolver at his side, though something deeper than instinct told him this wasn't just any visitor. Dust rose from the road, and out of it came a man on a bay horse, his posture stiff, his face tight with anger. The rider pulled hard on the reins, dismounted, and strode forward with a swagger born of entitlement. His eyes landed on the house, then on Calder, and finally on the woman who had just stepped into the doorway behind him. The bride froze, color draining from her cheeks as recognition set in. "That's him," she whispered, voice trembling. "The man who wrote the letters." The stranger's jaw tightened. "You," he spat, pointing at Calder. "You've got something that belongs to me." His words rang sharp in the morning air, carrying accusation and fury. "She was promised. I sent for her. I paid the fee, wrote the letters, made the arrangements. And you," his glare hardened, "you stole her." Calder's body went rigid, his protective instinct flaring. "She ain't property," he said flatly. "You don't own her." His voice was calm but edged with steel. Behind him, the bride clutched the doorway, torn between shame and fear, while the little girl peeked around her skirts, sensing the tension even if she didn't fully understand it. The stranger took a step forward, his eyes locked on her. "I waited months for you," he said, his tone softening just enough to sound convincing. "I built a place, worked my hands raw for a life we could share. And when I came, you were gone. They told me you'd been delivered here instead. And I want what's mine." The bride's throat tightened. Her past choices, her desperation. Because it was her only way out of a life that had been crushing her. But she had not known then what she knew now. The child suddenly burst forward, clutching at her skirts with fierce little hands. "Don't go," she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Don't leave us, Mama." The word, Mama, hung in the air like a bell tolling truth. The bride's breath caught, her body trembling as her heart swelled with a certainty she had not dared to name. Calder's eyes softened, though he said nothing, waiting, giving her the space to decide. She turned then, meeting the gaze of the man who had crossed miles to claim her. Her voice shook at first but grew steady with each word. "You did write the letters. You did send for me. And maybe I was meant to go to you." She paused, her hand resting protectively on the child's head. "But fate had other plans. I was brought here. To this place. To this family. And I've come to see that I was sent here for a reason." Her eyes lifted, locking with Calder's. "And my reason is them." The man's face twisted with fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed. But the bride stood tall, unflinching, her arm around the little girl who clung to her as though her life depended on it. Calder finally stepped forward, his stance leaving no room for doubt. "Then ride on," he said coldly. "You ain't welcome here." The stranger's glare burned, but with no ground left to claim, he mounted his horse and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the horizon. Silence settled over the ranch once more, but it was no longer fragile. This silence was heavy, unshakable, and full of meaning. The bride turned back to Calder, her chest rising with the weight of what she had chosen. She had cast her lot with them, not because of duty, not because of survival, but because her heart had found its home. Dawn broke soft and golden across the wide prairie, the kind of morning that seemed to wash away the darkness of all that had come before. The sky stretched endlessly, painted in hues of rose and amber, while the first light touched the edges of the ranch house, setting the world aglow. Calder stepped out into the yard, his boots crunching against the earth, and paused when he saw her standing there, the little girl at her side. For a long, quiet moment, none of them spoke. It was enough just to feel the stillness, the peace that had finally settled after so many storms. Calder moved closer, his roughened hand lifting slowly as though he feared the moment might dissolve if he acted too quickly. But the bride did not pull away. She met him halfway, her hand slipping into his. Their fingers wove together with a simple, undeniable truth. The child, watching with wide eyes, smiled through her tears as though she had been waiting for this all along. Calder glanced down at her, his grip tightening ever so slightly around the bride's hand, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of loneliness lift from his shoulders. Together, the three of them stood in the open field, facing the horizon as the sun climbed higher. The land stretched wide and untamed before them, both a challenge and a promise. Calder knew it would never be easy. Life on the frontier demanded sweat, patience, and sacrifice. But as he looked at the woman at his side and the little girl clutching her skirts, he understood that hardship no longer meant despair. Hardship shared could mean belonging, could mean family. The bride's gaze followed the horizon too, but then she looked back at the earth beneath their feet. "Seeds," she murmured softly as if speaking to herself. "If we're to begin again, let's plant something that will grow." Calder studied her for a moment, then gave a nod. It was a simple act, yet profound, something alive taking root where brokenness had once ruled. From the barn he retrieved a small sack of corn seed, the same kind his father had once planted when times were hard. He poured some into her hands, rough kernels spilling between her fingers. Then he knelt down in the soil, pressing the first seed into the earth. She knelt beside him, her skirt brushing the dirt, and did the same. The child laughed and clapped, her small hands eager to help, and together they pressed kernels into the ground one by one. It was not much, not yet, but it was enough to mark a beginning. When they finished, the bride leaned back on her heels and brushed the dirt from her palms, smiling faintly through the tears in her eyes. Calder looked at her then, really looked, and saw not a stranger forced into his life, but a woman who had chosen him, chosen this place, despite every reason to run. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and she let herself rest against his touch. The little girl's voice broke the silence, soft at first, almost timid. "God sent you," she whispered, the same words she had spoken once before when she feared being left behind. But this time she said them stronger, with a conviction that seemed to echo across the field. "God sent you." The bride's breath caught, her eyes glistening as she pulled the child into her arms. Calder wrapped them both in his embrace, the three of them bound together beneath the rising sun. And as the camera of life pulled back, across the golden fields, over the small ranch house and toward the wide, unending frontier, it revealed not three broken souls but one whole family. They stood hand in hand, framed by the vastness of the land, ready to face whatever might come. A new beginning had dawned.